श्री परमात्मने नमः। नारायणं नमस्कृत्य नरं चैव नरोत्तमं देवीं सरस्वतीं व्यासं ततो जयमुदीरयेत्। श्रीमद् भगवत गीता साधका संजीवनी, थर्ड चैप्टर, कर्म योगा, verses 30 to 35. Inspiration for the performance of one's own duty, being free from attachment and aversion. The Lord in verse 30 explains what a striver should do to be free from the attachment to action and its fruit. Verse 30. मायि सर्वाणि कर्माणि सन्न्यास्याध्यात्मा चेत्सा निराशीर्निर्ममो भूत्वा युध्यस्व विगतज्वरः. Surrendering all actions to me with the discriminative insight, being free from desire, the sense of mind and mental strain. Do your duty of waging the war. Comment. Generally, a striver holds that he has to perform the obligatory actions, but they lead him to bondage. In order to clarify his misconception, the Lord urges him to surrender all actions to him with the discriminative insight without having the least affinity for them. In fact, all the actions of the world are performed by the Lord's power. The body, senses, mind, objects, and power, etc., are the Lord's, and the Lord is His. By thinking so, when a striver performs actions, those actions, instead of leading him to bondage, lead him to salvation. A striver should have a spiritual aim of God rather than a mundane one. The man who has found his aim has the discriminative insight. In fact, a man's aim or necessity is to attain the imperishable spiritual, while his desire is to gain the perishable. A striver should decide the aim of his life instead of having a desire. An important fact pertaining to surrender. The Lord urges a man to surrender all actions to Him because He considers the body, senses, mind, intellect, life breath, material, and actions His own and for Himself. But in fact, these are neither His nor can be His. How can the perishable have affinity for the imperishable? Therefore, surrender all actions either to the world or to nature or to God. The result will be the same because the world is the evolute of nature and God is the Lord of nature. Thus, both the world and nature belong to God. Thus, a striver should think that he is God's and the so called his possessions are also God's. That is, he should renounce his attachment to them. In that case, he has to expect nothing either from the world or from God. The Lord Himself looks after His wants, needs. When a striver surrenders his body, etc., to Him, they don't seem to him to be his own. If they appear to him to be his own, it means that he has not surrendered them to Him. Therefore, the Lord has exhorted a striver to surrender them to Him with a discriminative insight. Thus, when a striver surrenders them to God, he comes to know the truth that in fact they are the Lord's, not His. An important fact pertaining to desire. The man, soul, is a fragment of God, but his disinclination for God and inclination towards the world gives birth to necessity as well as desires. When he totally renounces his assumed affinity for the world, his necessity is fulfilled and he gets rid of desires. An important fact. When a striver has God realization as the only goal of his life, all his possessions and things, whether superior or inferior, are surrendered to God. Having surrendered his actions and objects, he surrenders the desire, the sense of mindness and grief which appear in him to Him, God. Thus, he becomes a staunch devotee with exclusive devotion. Having stated his teaching principle in the preceding verse, Now, in the next two verses, the Lord substantiates the same. Verse 31. ये मे मतम् इदं नित्यम् अनुतिष्ठन्ति मानवाः श्रद्धावन्तो अंशुयन्तो मुच्यन्ते ते अपि कर्मभिः. These men who constantly follow this teaching of mine, as declared in the previous verse, with faith and without cavilling, are also released from the bondage of actions. Comment. Any person belonging to any caste, creed, sect, and order of life, etc., who wants to be released from the bondage of actions should practice this discipline by realizing the fact that the body, senses, mind, intellect, objects, and actions, etc., are not one's own. Men are released from this bondage. Question. What is the teaching of the Lord and how should it be practiced? Followed. Answer. All acquired things are not ours. This is the considered view of the Lord. Whatever materials, body, senses, mind, intellect, life, breath, riches, property, objects, etc., they are the evolutes of nature, and the world is also the evolute of nature. So all of them have identification with the world, while the self, being a fragment of God, has its identification with Him, God. Therefore, all of them are not our personal possessions, but they have been bestowed upon us so that we may utilize them properly. Besides them, the virtues such as good conduct, renunciation, dispassion, kindness, and forgiveness, etc., are also not personal. Being divine traits, they also belong to God. Had they been ours, they would have also remained with us, and no one could have acquired them without our permission. But it is not so. When we accept them as ours, we are proud of them, and pride is the root of demoniac endowment. Verse 32. ये त्वा एतद् अभ्यासयान्तो नानुतिष्ठन्ति मे मतम् सर्वज्ञानविमूढांस्तान् विधि नष्टान् अचेतसः. But those who carp at my teaching and do not follow it, deluded of all knowledge and devoid of discrimination, know them to be doomed to destruction. Comment. Those who do not follow the Lord's teaching are under delusion regarding worldly knowledge, sciences, arts, etc. They remain engrossed in the inventions and scientific discoveries like motor cars, aeroplanes, radios, televisions, etc. Similarly, they remain engaged in knowing painting, architecture, arts, crafts, mystical formulas, incantations, implements, different scripts and languages, custom traditions, and other marvels. They are fully convinced that there is nothing beyond these things. Such people are said to be under delusion regarding all knowledge. They are devoid of discrimination because they can't distinguish the real from the unreal, righteousness from unrighteousness, salvation from bondage, and so on. They remain ignorant like animals, of vain hopes, of vain actions, of vain knowledge, and senseless. They verily are. Know those human beings who don't follow the Lord's teaching to be doomed to destruction. It means that they will go on following the cycle of birth and death. In the 31st verse, the Lord declares that those who follow His teachings are released from the bondage of actions, while in this verse He declares that those who don't follow His teaching are to be doomed to destruction. It means that the Lord urges people to follow His teaching even if they don't believe in Him. If they don't follow His teaching, they will be doomed to destruction. But if a striver believing in Him, God, follows His teaching, he offers himself to Him. If he, without believing in Him, God, follows His teaching, He leads him to salvation. It means that he who believes in Him attains His love, while he who follows His teaching attains salvation. Why are those people who don't follow the Lord's teaching doomed to destruction? The Lord answers the question in the next verse. Verse 33. Sadrisham cheshte swasya प्रकृतिर्ज्ञानवान् अपि प्रकृतिं यान्ति भूतानि निग्रहः किं करिष्यति. Even a wise man acts in accordance with his own nature. Beings follow their nature. What can restraint do? Comment. All actions are performed either according to one's own nature or according to the Lord's principle. Scriptural injunctions. One's nature can be of two kinds: free from attachment and aversion, and having attachment and aversion. A man on his way happens to see a notice board. His casting a glance at it is neither because of attachment nor aversion, nor from the angle of principle. This is through his pure personal nature. We read the letter received from a friend with attachment, while that of an enemy with aversion. We study the sacred texts such as the Gita and the Ramayana according to the Lord's principle. The only aim of human life is God realization. Therefore, the actions which are performed with the aim of God realization are performed according to His principle, that is, according to the scriptural injunctions. All actions such as seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, etc., are performed according to one's nature and according to His principle. The nature free from attachment and aversion is not defective, while the nature with attachment and aversion is defective. The actions which are performed out of attachment and aversion bind a man because they make the nature impure. On the other hand, the actions which are performed according to his principle lead to salvation because they purify the nature. All the actions of a striver whose aim is God realization are performed according to the scriptural injunctions. As a greedy person is always careful that he should not sustain any loss, a striver is always careful lest he should perform an activity with attachment or aversion. By being careful, a striver's nature is purified and consequently he is liberated from the bondage of actions. It is attachment to material objects which inspires a person to perform evil actions. For a striver, attachment is the main cause of bondage. Attachment dwells in assumed egoism and appears in mind, intellect, senses, and sense objects. A perfect soul, being free from attachment and aversion, acts in accordance with his pure nature. He is not swayed by nature. As a learned man speaks the language which he knows. Similarly, the Lord also believes in accordance with his incarnation as Rama or Krishna, or the fish, the tortoise, or the hog, etc., but does not remain completely under the sway of nature, Prakriti. Similarly, those enlightened souls who have renounced their affinity for matter, Prakriti, may vary in their nature but are not swayed by it. So their actions are nothing more than gestures of action, while common men who have not renounced their affinity for matter act according to individual nature, natural propensities, and remain completely under its sway. If a striver does not want to come under the sway of nature, he should perform his duty by fixing an ideal before him. The ideal model can be of two kinds: one, the Lord's teaching; two, wise men's actions. By following the Lord's teaching or wise men's actions, the striver's nature is purified and he realizes God, who is ever attained. On the other hand, the man who, without following the Lord's teaching or the wise man's actions, performs actions out of attachment and aversion is doomed to destruction. As we cannot forcibly obstruct the course of a river but can turn it to the other direction, similarly, we can turn the flow of our actions towards the welfare of others. When we perform them for the welfare of others, their flow is towards the world, and we, the strivers, are liberated from the bondage of actions. Every man is born with his own nature. Therefore, he has to act according to his nature. Now, the Lord in the next verse explains how to purify one's nature. Verse 34. Indriyasya indriyasarthe raga dvesha vyavastitao tayorna vasham agachetao hyasya paripantino. Attachment and aversion for the objects of the senses abide in the senses. Let no one come under their sway, for they are his way layers, foes. Comment. Each sense has attraction for its pleasant object. Ear, eye, skin, tongue, and nose for sound, sight, touch, taste, and smell, respectively, and aversion for an unpleasant object. In fact, attachment and aversion don't abide in the sense objects. Had they abode in the sense objects, the same objects might have been pleasant, desirable, or unpleasant, undesirable equally to everyone. But it does not happen. Rain is desirable to a farmer, but it is undesirable to a potter. Moreover, the same object is sometimes pleasant, while it is unpleasant at other time to the same person. Cool air is pleasant in summer, but unpleasant in winter. Thus, we have attraction and aversion for them by regarding them as desirable and undesirable. When a striver starts adoration, renouncing the worldly affairs, the good and bad thoughts of the world come to his mind, and so he gets perturbed. The Lord urges him not to be perturbed because they are perishable. They appear and disappear. In fact, thoughts have no existence of their own because it is a principle that what is born must die. In fact, these thoughts don't come to the mind. They rather slip away from the mind. The thoughts remain suppressed when a man is busy with worldly affairs, but when he stops the work, the suppressed thoughts have an outlet. Therefore, a striver without having attachment or aversion to them should remain indifferent to them. Similarly, he should also have neither attachment nor aversion to persons and things, etc. The means of overcoming attachment and aversion. Service to others without expecting any reward is a panacea to wipe out attachment and aversion. All our possessions, including the physical, subtle, and causal bodies, as well as egoism, are to render service to the world because they are essentially the same as is the world. The assumption that they are different from the world leads to bondage. A striver should not derive pleasure out of things and actions with the physical body, out of thinking with the subtle body, and out of trance with the causal body. In fact, this human body is not for pleasures. Secondly, the body, senses, mind, intellect, and objects, etc., with which service is rendered, are the fragments of the world. How can the fragments of the world be ours when the world is not ours? We can't render service to others with them in a disinterested way if we regard them as ours. Therefore, we should regard them as of those whose service is rendered with them. A devotee surrenders them to God by regarding them as his gods. Similarly, a karma yogi surrenders them to the world by regarding them as the world's. A vital fact pertaining to service. He alone can render true service to others who never requires anything for himself. The desire for money in lieu of service is no doubt a desire, but an inclination to serve is also a desire because it results in a desire for riches. A striver should not have a desire to acquire money even for rendering service to others. If he gets an opportunity, he should render service according to his resources, but he should have no desire to render service. He who derives pleasure by rendering service to others, or has the sentiment that people are benefited by him, or expects honor and praise, or gets pleased by receiving honor and praise, in fact, enjoys pleasures instead of rendering true service. If a striver derives pleasure out of it, it gives birth to attachment and desire. In fact, the objects with which he renders service to others belong to them. So, there is no obligation if their trust property is handed over to them. Does anyone want any reward having washed his face with his hands? Question. How can service be rendered without objects and money, etc.? So, what is the harm if anyone desires money and objects in order to render service to others? Answer. Service with material objects is a gross type of service. Real service is a motive, not an action. Action leads to bondage, while service releases from bondage. The sense of service impels a man to use his possessions in the service of others. Real service is rendered through feelings rather than through actions. A man of generous feeling can render service with the limited resources he has. He who attaches importance to objects can't render service with them because he has pride in doing so, and thus he derives pleasure out of his action, whether he knows it or not. A shopkeeper gives articles to others, but he does not render service because he has a desire to receive money in exchange. Similarly, the money which is paid as tax to the king, state, can't be called charity. If a person offers charity or food or water to someone in order to reap its fruit, his affinity for the object is not renounced. But if he offers the articles without expecting any reward, it means that he renders service and his affinity for those objects is renounced. He who renders service to others from his heart arouses feelings of service in their hearts also. If this feeling is not aroused in their hearts, it means that there has been a flaw, such as of reaping the fruit in it. A striver should be on the alert in this respect. While rendering service, he should never expect to be called virtuous or good because this feeling develops pride in him. When we rise above attachment and aversion, what should we do and what should we refrain from doing? The Lord answers this question in the verse that follows. Verse 35. श्रेयान् स्वधर्मो विगुणः पराधर्मात् स्व अनुतिष्ठात् स्वधर्मे निधनं श्रेयः पराधर्मो भयावहः. Better is one's own duty, though devoid of merit, than the duty of another well discharged. Better is death in one's own duty. The duty of another is fraught with fear, is dangerous. Comment. One's duty according to one's caste and order of life, even though may appear devoid of merits, leads to salvation. A Kshatriya's duty of fighting, which involves violence, should fight as it will lead him to salvation. According to one's caste and order of life, etc., outwardly actions, duties, may seem terrible or mild, but they are performed with the only aim of God realization. When a person forgets the real aim of life, that is, God realization, and attaches importance to the worldly objects, the actions seem terrible or mild to him. Under no circumstances one should discard his duty. Question. How to know for certain that death while performing one's own duty leads only to salvation? Answer. The Gita is a gospel of Lord Krishna himself, so there should not arise any doubt about his teaching. Secondly, this is a topic of faith and belief rather than reasoning. Yet certain points are there which may clarify the doubt. 1. Whatever is not known to us should be decided by the scriptures. 2. The history also reveals the fact that he who performs his duty with sincerity attains salvation. King Harishchandra did not deviate from truth in the face of adversity, insult, and dishonor. Consequently, he, along with his subjects, attained the supreme abode. 3. Nowadays, we come across many incidents of rebirth which reveal that creatures go to higher or lower worlds according to their good or bad deeds. 4. Not to speak of a believer, even a non-believer, by performing his duty sincerely without any selfish motive, gains peace or joy, which is a characteristic of the mode of goodness. This peace is a mark of salvation or the supreme peace. Therefore, our own experience proves that performance of one's duty, discarding forbidden actions, leads to salvation. A vital fact pertaining to one's own duty and the duty of another. Nature, Prakriti, and its evolved body and world are different from God and the self soul. Duty of the self is one's own duty, while the duty of nature, the body, and the world is the duty of another. Absence of modification, flawlessness, imperishability, eternity, desirelessness, and non attachment are the duties of the self, while modifications, flaws, mortality, and desires for pleasures, prosperity, honor, and praise, etc., are the duties of the body and the world, and therefore are the duties of another. The duty of the self is imperishable because the self is imperishable, while the duty of the body is perishable because the body ever undergoes modifications. The self is a fragment of God, while the body is a fragment of nature, Prakriti. The desire for self realization and God realization is the duty of the self because the self is a fragment of God, while the desire for pleasure and prosperity is the duty of another, Paradharma. This desire for pleasure and prosperity is aroused by accepting affinity for the unreal body. A desire for one's ultimate good is one's duty because, being a fragment of God, one's own desire is the desire of God Himself and not that of the world. A man is independent in performing his own duty of God realization or self realization or salvation because in it there is no need of the body, senses, mind, and intellect, etc. But there is need to sever connection with them. But in performing the duty for another, a man is dependent because it needs the body, senses, mind, intellect, things, and persons, etc. All the virtuous actions such as pilgrimage, fast, penance, meditation, and trance, etc., performed with physical, subtle, and causal bodies with the expectation of reward, that is, with a selfish motive turned to be paradharma, the duty of another. But if they are performed for the welfare of others without expecting any reward, they become swadharma, one's own duty. The reason is that the self is desireless, while desire is born by having affinity for nature, prakriti. So, when a man having desire performs his duty, it becomes the duty of another. One's own duty leads to salvation, while the duty of another leads to bondage. All the pains, sorrows, and worries, etc., of the world are born by the performance of the duty of another, while the performance of one's own duty leads to the eternal bliss. Om Tat Sat. All glories to Sri Partha Sarthi, Lord Shri Krishna. All glories to Bhagavad Vani, Srimad Bhagavad Gita. Sri Hari Arpanamastu.